Always serious, never fun. I think that's my new slogan. Still, that's what I go for. So we have you back. What happened to Ruby? It was such an upgrade.
Yeah, commiserations to the listeners involved. Stu is back after a 2-week hiatus. I think a fairly appropriate hiatus. My second daughter, Matilda, was born a couple of weeks ago. Certainly a good reason to come back. But I realized if I missed any more episodes, I was probably getting usurped. I think the millions of listeners might have protested if Ruby had any more access. Grateful for her. She's amazing. And I listened to some of the work she was doing. And as a first time podcaster, she crushed it. But now you're back with Mr. Always Serious.
So I actually started getting fan mail delivered to my house. Baby, like, is Stu okay? Is everything good? So it's good to know that you're back, baby, and mommy are healthy.
Everything is good.
Cool, man. Well, so it's good to have you back, mate. We've got a really good guest lined up today. So I'm going to give him a second we'll bring him on in just a second. But I did have a continuing theme that I wanted to bring up from last week. So last week, Ruby asked me, like, how was I doing? I was like, I was in Toronto, life was good. And I was commiserating that how old I was getting because I had somehow like hurt my Achilles tendon. And then lo and behold, this weekend, I stepped outside and like busted my knee. And I'm like, this is not fun. So
It happens. Life comes at you fast.
maybe I need to do some more golfing or something, keep everything moving.
100%.
Less work. Welcome to Zero Signal. It's a podcast where we're talking about the future of AI, security, resiliency, and leadership. And so today we're joined by Walter Haydock, the founder and CEO of StackAware, a leader in AI governance, security, and compliance. And he has a unique background spanning being a U.S. Marine Corps to his time on Capitol Hill. And now you're in the front lines of enterprise AI risk management. Walter, welcome to the show.
Gentlemen, thank you for having me on.
So I don't think Stu knows this, but the way I got connected with you was about 9 months ago when my last CISO role. It was full on AI governance mode. And it was like, I needed to find who are the experts in the field who are going to give me the shortcut to success. And everywhere I turned, everyone's like, well, have you talked to Walter yet? Have you talked to Walter yet? And I was like, all right, I got to go talk to this guy. And so that was my introduction to you, was when my entire LinkedIn network screamed at me, go talk to Walter. So it's really cool to kind of come like full circle and have you on the episode tonight.
Awesome.
Well, thanks for having me on.
That's great. Walter, would love to understand a little bit more if you could give the listeners just an intro to your background and how you got to where you got to and what it is you do today.
Yeah, absolutely. So I founded StackAware about 3 years ago, and we are a technology-enabled white glove services firm that works with AI-powered companies in healthcare, financial services, and B2B SaaS to measure and manage cybersecurity compliance and privacy risk. Our primary method of interaction is preparing companies for ISO 42001 certification. And we use that framework as a way to deliver actionable risk management techniques to our customers. As far as background, I have been in the security space for a bit. I worked previously at a venture-backed startup in the data governance space, and then at a bigger industrial automation company called PTC, focused on IoT cybersecurity. And then prior to that, served in the US government in a variety of roles as a staffer on Capitol Hill on the House Homeland Security Committee, as an intelligence analyst at the National Counterterrorism Center, and then as a Marine Corps reconnaissance and intelligence officer before that.
So we've got a few things lined up for the audience tonight I'm really excited about. I want to get your perspectives on risk management, especially in regulated sectors like healthcare. We'll have an opportunity to touch into red teaming and continuous safety testing. And then also one of the things that you've been talking and writing a lot about is that most of the areas that most technology companies inherit their AI-oriented risk is from a vendor supply risk perspective. So we'll get to that section as well. So these are going to be some of the areas that I wanted to get your perspectives and your inputs on as we go through the conversation today. So with that, I'll just tee us up and talk about, like, we all know that AI is rewriting the rules of business, and the rules governing AI is beginning to be written in real time here. So we've got states, we've got courts, we've got companies, and they're all kind of racing to keep up with the pace of technology change. So a few headline items recently is we've got California's new whistleblower protections that came in. We've got New York's AI court policies that are coming up. And We're also seeing new research come out on pushing the bleeding edge of, as you start to push the boundaries of these frontier models, we're finding that they're kind of always breaking. There's always security risk here that we're capturing. So we're going to dive into the fragmented high stakes world of AI law and how to operate that trust. So let's get into our first topic. So the first one I want to talk about is the fragmented rise of state and local AI laws in the United States. So we've just seen California has just become the first state to require AI companies to publicly disclose their plans on preventing catastrophic risks. California's new law is the first in the nation that's going to require companies to publicly disclose their plans for preventing catastrophic risk. Meanwhile, New York is rolling out new AI rules for courts and governments. And we have seen federal efforts to override state laws. We've seen that fail. So, Walter, I wanted to just kind of start tonight's conversation with, we're seeing this patchwork of rules. How do leaders prioritize compliance and innovation at the same time? Where
Great
should we think
question.
about starting that? Yeah.
Yeah. So you're always going to need to balance your risks against the potential for reward. And the easiest way to zero out your compliance risk is to not do anything. Now, that could create some other risks as well from a business perspective. Your shareholders may not be happy with that. So, in the face of that reality, you need to use the classic 4 risk management techniques of mitigate, transfer, accept, or avoid the risk. So I'll give some examples in the context of AI and regulation. So risk avoidance, I've seen some companies do novel things such as disabling certain features in certain geographical areas. So I saw an HR company disable its AI scoring tool in New York City because New York City has a law, local law 144, that regulates the use of automated employment decision tools. They just said, you know what? We're not even going to play with this. We're just disabling this functionality. So that's risk avoidance. Transfer, companies buy insurance all the time. That's pretty standard. We're also seeing, this is more on a contractual level, indemnification agreements whereby the hyperscale AI providers are offering the ability to defend their customers if they come under suit for use of their AI outputs. From a mitigate perspective, we're seeing things like developing AI governance programs or deploying technical tools or training employees. And then acceptance is kind of self-explanatory in that you press along despite the potential risk. And, to be clear, you've got to accept some risk to do business. So accept is not necessarily the wrong answer. Anyone who tells you that he or she does not accept any risk, I would say, well, then you should not have gotten out of bed this morning.
With being a chief security officer, like this is not the role to play if you do not know how to navigate risk. Like risk is the currency that we deal with every single day. That is the game. That is the ball of like that is the whole thing.
Yeah, it's all about threshold, pain tolerance, right? Like I always got the best analogy I ever got is the safest way to go skiing is to not go. The second safest way to go is ski in Kevlar, but that doesn't make sense. You ski but that's the same framework, right? The safest way is to ski within your means and to wear a helmet, right? Like that's the reality of it. Some people don't follow that, like myself, who just goes crazy, but that's risk acceptance. I make that decision. But that analogy has always stuck with me, and I think for those potentially non-technical listeners, the safest thing to do is not do it. But the reality is you miss out on everything.
Right. And I think that's and the most important thing. So when I'm in the seat of as a CISO and you're navigating it, like the principal conversation we're always having as an executive team is, are we going to achieve our goals? Then the question becomes, how do you achieve that? Right? What's your objective? And you back into like, where are you going to go with that? When you're working about like, how do you back into that? Then it becomes around what's your risk tolerance? What's the speed you want to go at? What is your risk acceptance levels? So are you going to be risk aggressive or you're going to be risk off? Like we have the balance, and that's just the way it goes. And so the good security leader is someone who can come aboard and say clear-eyed to the business, here is the risk that you carry by having that module turned on in New York State. Here's what can go wrong. Here's a likelihood of this being an issue. Great. Do we want to do this? They said that was outside of their risk tolerance. They turned that feature off. That's an interesting one. I would have been like, hey, can we mitigate the problem? Can we put in, and there could be all these other things that you do in place to have these mitigating controls to reduce the risk. But that is the name of the game, right? The name of the game is, as a security leader, is like, how do you help do
Connor, if you
exactly
were
what you
hiring,
want
you'd have
very
just
well?
transferred the risk over to me. That's how it'd have been risk transference, and you'd have made me do the scoring in New York City. So I know how this works. It's risk transference. Also, when you're advising companies, are you using like the California type AI programs as the bar when it comes to AI compliance? Again, are you thinking that these are the best that they should be driving towards, or is it more of a case by case basis?
It's definitely a case by case basis. So StackAware takes a very tailored approach when we're making our recommendations to customers. You mentioned the California approach, and off the top of my head, I could tell you 4 different laws and regulations in California that could be applicable to customers using AI. There's the Transparency and Frontier Artificial Intelligence Act, which you referred to earlier, to FIA, if they'll let me call it that. Then there's AB 2013, which was passed at the end of 2024, which requires transparency in generative AI training data. Then there's the California Office of, I don't even know, Office of Administrative Law Regulations on Automated Decision Systems. And now, just recently, the California Consumer Privacy Act agency, they passed some new regulations to the CCPA that regulate automated decision-making technology, which is separate from ADS. So if you're going to drill down into even one jurisdiction's rules on AI, it's going to get really complex really quickly. We take a tailored approach where we look at the use case for the customer, and then we look at the potential applicable legislation, and then we make recommendations based on that.
As a security leader who needs to be able to be in an informed position to advise their peer group, how do they tie these frameworks like ISO 42001 and these regulations that we see at the state level coming up? And where do those two meet? Where are they different? How should we be thinking about structuring a program like that?
ISO 42001 is the beginning of the conversation when it comes to regulatory compliance, not the end of it. So what it does is it gives you a way to ingest a variety of different internal and external issues, to use the ISO terminology, which can certainly include legal and regulatory obligations, and then use those to drive an AI management system, which allows you to meet those requirements. Now, I will say ISO 42001 is unique in that it is the only compliance standard I've seen referred to in past legislation. For example, in Colorado, the Colorado Artificial Intelligence Act specifically identifies a risk management program built around ISO 42001 as potentially providing safe harbor under certain circumstances against alleged violations of the law. So that's how ISO 42001 interacts with these regulatory requirements.
We have this AI risk management conversation with, you got the EU's AI Act, you've got the 4201 that you're just describing, there's a NIST RMF. Those are risk management frameworks, separate and distinct from the regulations. You then have control sets that we would implement to handle certain risks. And then, of course, then we also have the regulations we just mentioned here. I think there's the growing need for harmonization across these frameworks. I think there's a need to get these frameworks to work together where AI governance can start to work together and truly realize that vision of being something where the cost of operations comes down to a level where it truly can be a revenue enabler. And so, Walter, what is your perspective on this direction of harmonizing these controls? Do you see us going in that direction? Do you think they need to stay separate because they have different strengths and weaknesses? Love to get your thoughts on that. And then, Stu, I'll turn it over to you.
From a US federal level, I would love to see a comprehensive AI governance and also throw in data privacy and cybersecurity bill that preempts the state level regulations that are springing up right and left. I think that would do wonders from a business perspective to help make it easier just to do stuff. And we're seeing Europe take that general approach. However, they're taking a much heavier hand when they are standardizing those regulations with the EU AI Act. On the non-regulatory or legislative requirements, for example, ISO 42001, I think we're seeing 42001 take off as the international standard for AI management systems. The NIST AI RMF was a little bit of an early mover in that respect, but I don't think we're going to see as much adoption. Also, probably because it's not as prescriptive as the ISO standards are when it comes to how you build your program.
Yeah.
Got
Yeah.
it.
I look,
Yes.
I think like I think there is a need. There is a federal need. I think people need to know, like, no one knows where to start. Like, and that's, I think, the issue. Like, what is the baseline? What is the minimum viable layer of compliance if I'm utilizing LLMs? And I think on the flip side, if we look at the EU AI Act, right? Connor, we talked about this a few episodes ago. Like, there is already a fairly large chasm between the ability to innovate in the United States versus Europe, right? Like, and actually,
Right.
London are doing a pretty good job at the moment, but like the innovation coming out of Europe, as someone who came from there, is frankly disappointing. And it again, they continue to make it difficult in a world where there's a shot that playing field could level because you don't have to be in Silicon Valley with your hand out with the Sutter Hill crew getting, 500 million from Costa or Sequoia or whoever it may be, to come and play ball here. The European Union are making that very difficult. Connor, I can't remember there was a study in terms of how much further, like the AI economies that we talked about,
Yeah.
and regulation is naturally important, but over regulation is also a business killer. Wow, you are so good that you have this. I'm sure you probably used an AI tool to go and find it, but or Google, like Google still exists. But this is like I think over regulation could do this. That said, and Walter probably knows this, like regulation's also good for business, and we'll probably keep the team pretty busy there. So we don't want no regulation either.
Yeah, and so guys, what we have on the screen here is what Stu was referring to was the Anthropic Economic Index. This they released in September, so about a month ago. And it was exactly what you're saying there, Stu, is that they're seeing the adoption of AI is different when you drill into the geographies. And so lo and behold, the US is consuming this technology far more than the rest of the planet. And then you'll even have hotspots inside the US in different areas. Not surprisingly, you see it along the coasts and you see it along where the tech hubs are. But to your point there, Stu, it's like if the promise of AI really is to be this engine of economic growth, then you ideally would like to see that distributed equally. And then we have to think about what is going to drive that adoption or what is going to hamper that adoption. And there is an argument to be made that it's not in and of itself the regulation that's going to hamper the adoption. It's the inconsistencies of that. And Walter's like kind of what you're pointing out. It's like you can be in the same state serving the same customer or the related fields, and you'll have two sets of regulatory bodies who are saying things differently and sometimes maybe even contradicting each other. So
I would love to know, like, arguably the United States' biggest rival for innovation is China, right? I would love to understand, and I don't know, Walter, maybe if this is something you've looked at, but what the Chinese view is on compliance and regulation with their AI policy. I don't know if that's something you'd know off the top of the head, but that's probably the closest rival when it comes to innovation and how they're thinking about it as they deploy LLMs. Putting you on the spot here if you do know.
Yeah, in China, there is a much more.
Yeah.
Now, China is ostensibly communist, but it does have private sector organizations that operate in the country and quite effectively in certain areas. But there is a clear requirement for tech titans to bow and to kiss the ring of the government. Whereas in the US, right now, you might ask yourself, who's kind of running the show right now? Is it the government folks or the Silicon Valley people who are nestled close to the centers of power in the US? So I think it's an interesting difference in dynamic. And I'll say in China, technology must serve the state. Whereas in the United States, there are certain people who maybe wouldn't admit this publicly, but behave as if the technology serves itself.
And in the US, in China, you don't get audited by PwC or maybe a few government agents. Like when they come, it is the full force of the government, and they do not wear suit, like sit in nice offices wearing suits. Like when they come, they come.
Yeah, if you look at, for example, right after the Log4Shell vulnerability disclosure in China, I think it was an engineer at Alibaba Cloud who actually reported that to the Apache Foundation. And Alibaba, and I believe that engineer personally, were punished as a result of making that disclosure, which was I think ethically the right move, but
Yeah.
illegal in China potentially.
So on this idea of unified control frameworks, I just want to basically highlight something and get your guys' take on this. I was reading through this paper the other day. I mean, I love archive. Like there's so much good, high quality content on there to read through. And there was a few folks had put out this idea of having a unified control framework. And what I thought was interesting, and this is where I want both of your opinions. And Walter, I'll hand the mic to you in just a second. Is when you read through this, what they're basically saying here. Oh, sorry, I can't read it out from the introduction here. Is that when we look at the existing control frameworks we have in place with ISO 42001 or others, what they're really good at is, as you described earlier, establishing a risk management framework, right? This is how you're going to go about building out the risk again, the system, the engine of how it's going to ingest data. It's going to understand risks. It's going to put out recommendations and do risk treatments, so on and so forth. But what they're arguing is that what it doesn't do is be specific enough in the control language on how to handle the specific AI threats. So this paper, which we'll put in the show notes here, is called the Unified Control Framework, Establishing a Common Foundation for Enterprise AI Governance, Risk Management, and Regulatory Compliance. It dropped March of this year. And the one thing I wanted to highlight for the audience here was this visual here. And it's a little hard to come across the screen, but what you can see is it's this idea that you have a relationship of your policy statements to your risk taxonomy, then you're going to have an inventory of controls and you're clearly able to map them back. So it really is an idea of trying to say, can we take what we've learned from GRC for the past 10, 15 years, distill it, and bring those practices into AI control management? And then they go on as far as to say, there are these risk categories. There's about 15 of these risk types, they call them. Then they map them to these scenarios that are specific to what can go wrong with AI systems. And there's about 50 of those. And they're using a risk technology that's basically following that MNC principle of the risks are both mutually exclusively and collectively exhaustive. So here is some work that was put out last March that said, if we look at how AI systems behave at that time, now a lot has changed in 6 months. So now we have to say, do we have this inventory of risks? We have this is risk scenarios. We have they bubble up into these risk types, and then we have this whole catalog of risk mitigating controls you put in place to mitigate those risks. So this is a really long way of saying, like, when we look at this idea of a unifying control framework for like control implementation, which would back up into a risk management program, do you think there's an appetite for this, Walter? Do you think this is the direction that we're going to need to head into if we're going to have organizations adopt and adopt and mature how they're managing the risks around AI?
Bottom line, yes. I will say that Credo AI, which published this paper, I consider to be a competitor of StackAware. So the way that we're doing it is better, of course. But no, but from a theoretical or from a conceptual perspective, I agree with the approach. And here's, for example, how StackAware approaches this problem: is we have the high level of AI risks, which is similar to what you just showed there, which are things like unintended training or unwitting undesired output, which are general categories of risks that can incorporate different systems, models, things like that. Then the next layer down are risks that are specific to information systems or models that are publicly known. So for example, if you go to chatgpt.com without making any configuration changes and you start typing in information, OpenAI reserves the right to train on that data. A risk associated with ChatGPT, the free version, is unintended training. Then the kind of most detailed level would be for a specific customer, for their use case in a certain environment, in a certain jurisdiction. You're using this type of tool in this jurisdiction, and it's an HR tool and it trips New York local law 144. Then what sort of controls do you apply? So yes, generally, I think that's the right approach. And that's how we do our risk assessments and treatment programs at StackAware.
So maybe from there, we can transition over to this idea of Because when you have a really good control framework, the next thing you need to be doing is like testing it. Does your actual control library actually mitigate the risk? And so gets really fun. And it actually ties back into what we were talking about earlier with SB 53. There's been recent headlines that have come out where saying, basically, it has been showing that every major AI model is failing the security tests when they're pushed. And so there's a landmark paper that was put out saying this exact same thing. There's always a break. There's always a security issue that shows up. And what I found fascinating by this as I was reading this is that we actually had the CESD on the podcast a few weeks ago, and we just released her episode. And she was talking about this idea that when you look at the mathematics of how these models come together, how transformer technology actually works, what you end up with is this 25-dimensional space. And her argument was like, red team it all day long, as much as you want. You will always find an edge case. You will always find the opportunity to break it because that's just the way transformers work, which I thought was really insightful. I had never heard that until she told me that. And so, like, remembering that, then we hear these headlines and these researchers coming out and saying, like, we can go to every single major model on the planet and we can push the limits, we can pen test them. And sure enough, we're going to find a breaking point. And I will just give you this headline before I get your take on that, Walter. And that is Eric Schmidt, from ex-Google CEO Eric Schmidt, warns AI models can be hacked. They'll learn how to kill someone. That's the headline on the embassy. But then it goes down as it goes through the article to talk through this idea of like, there are risks, there are real risks, and because you don't, on open source models, you don't necessarily know what the weights are, you don't necessarily know what the safety parameters are inside of those. And he says, but he still holds the value point that like, we still should be adopting this technology and we should just be managing the risk as we go along for that. So I wanted to get your perspective on this idea of, is there a world where AI gets to the point where it's secure? Does it get to the point where maybe it's just safe enough? How should security leaders be maybe framing this conversation when they're seeing that their enterprise is migrating from deterministic software to probabilistic software? And every time we test that probabilistic software, we find breaking points at the edge.
Just like there is no such thing in my mind as a vulnerability in an abstract sense. For example, the CVE program basically creates a scale of vulnerabilities, but without applying any sort of context to them. I would say at the same time, there's no such thing as secure enough in a vacuum. You need to understand what the potential gain to be had is before you can make an educated decision. So, for example, healthcare is an incredibly high risk but high reward use case for artificial intelligence. High risk because you have, the data security and privacy issues related to protected health information. You've got the accuracy issues. You've got a whole bunch of regulatory issues involved. But at the same time, especially in the United States, we spend the most per capita on healthcare in the world, and we have some pretty poor outcomes for what we spend. So we're in need of some pretty serious innovation to tackle these problems. And people die from bad healthcare, from bad diets, from bad recommendations all the time provided by the legacy healthcare system. So we need to weigh the potential risks against the rewards to be had when we're making these types of decisions.
So I very much agree with that. Stu, what was your take when you were reading that article that you sent me over, when you see the headline that the ex-CEO of Google is saying like, yep, they're definitely going to learn how to do a lot. And part of that will be how to do bad things like kill someone. That is probably the most dramatic headline I've seen all week.
Yeah, look, it's a little clickbaity. Let's be real, right? Media gets paid by getting clicks, so it is what it is. Look, and I think to be clear, it is not you have to be careful with some of these articles. It is not a AI is trash article. So I think sometimes you have to be a little careful. It's not, it's a fairly balanced piece. I think this is a clear example, as Walter said, in terms of like, okay, what is the risk of us going all in on this technology? If we look at every eventual outcome of what this means, I still am of the elf that if there is an outcome where this does not end well for humanity. That said, I think the pros, at least today, outweigh the cons in terms of us moving forward with this incredible, potentially revolutionary technology. Today, we'll see how that is in the long run. And this is the perfect example of like, okay, we have to move forward appropriately. We have to do what we can to put the the checks and balances in place. And pending that, it goes on to say that actually AI is underrated. On the flip side, there is a lot of talk about, an AI bubble right now and whether this is not a thing. And I think he goes on to say that it is an underrated and, this will transform the way that we live in the next 3, 5, 10, 15 years. So I think it is a balanced article. It's a clickbaity headline, but I think it underpins like there is an eventuality that some stuff, if you do not act with caution, if you don't, have every guardrail and hygiene in place, that not only like could you get, could it impact your business or your bottom line, but like people could die and this could have real meaningful impact.
It's kind of what you said too, Walter. I think that was a great anchoring of that scenario where we often think about like the AI Terminator mode. But what you described earlier is like, well, actually, how about a highly inefficient healthcare system that's killing people all day long?
Or bad
Like
drivers.
Yeah, or bad drivers. That's a great example. It's like, so we looked at these things and I wonder if not our struggle at this moment is we are desperately trying to say this is perfect technology and we're going to get this technology point is perfect, and the answer is it's never going to get perfect, right? And we go back to the idea of like the mathematical multi-dimensional space of attack surface for these models is a 25-dimensional space, or we start to think about the intricacies of how these systems are going to work with this new infrastructure. It's like we're always going to have breaking points along the way,
Yeah.
and it's do we get a better quality output, not do we get a perfect.
I think the issue is we hold technology to an unfairly comparable standard, right? Like I think if we look at drivers as an example, humans suck at driving. Like they're on their phones, like it's bad. Cruise, I will use as an example, they had one pretty bad use case, and I think a lot of people know about it, and but they had millions of other perfect drives. One bad use case, pretty much eviscerated. They got rolled up into General Motors because we hold machines to an unfairly high standard. Whereas, like, if I jumped in an Uber or a Waymo now, I feel great about that. Like, I would much rather that than a teenager who's just got their license or, someone looking down at their phone. And the same is said with, engineering and, everything that we're doing from an AI software perspective. The standards are just comparatively just very unfair. And I think that's the biggest boundary that we need to break if we're really going to move forward is 99.9% perfection okay? And I think if we get okay with that versus scrutinizing that it's not perfect, I think that's where we'll get to move forward. But I think that might take some time in truth.
Walter, what's your take on that? Like how, when you're in the room advising and guiding executives on managing this risk, do you see that dynamic where there's this desire for it to be perfect and it's not? Do you think there's a soberness around how and where this technology is getting adopted? I mean, I'm asking you to speak like broadly. I mean, you do a lot of work, you give a lot of talks on industry, you give a lot of like workshops and such. So just as you're been in this game now for 3 years, you've seen a lot of people and you've interacted with a lot of leaders. Do you think there's like a clear-eyed awareness of the risks they're carrying by moving their business systems to these agentic or AI systems? Or do you think there's still a lot more education needs to happen?
I have the pleasure of working with the top 10% of companies when it comes to sophistication about AI governance. So these are organizations that understand there are risks and are taking affirmative steps to manage them. The other 90% are either they haven't even started with AI or they're just kind of going crazy to an extent and allowing people to run wild. I think it's interesting in that I've seen two approaches that are both potentially flawed, and very rarely do I see balanced approaches. Of course, my customers take balanced approaches, but the two flawed approaches I've seen have been the kind of YOLO perspective where, this is our only opportunity. We got to start using these tools, whatever the consequences are. And then alternatively, there are people who, like Stuart was saying, hold the system to what I consider to be an unrealistic standard. And it is natural from human nature to value potential losses approximately twice as highly as potential gains. That's just prospect theory, which has been validated in a lot of experiments. So it's understandable that people will value a potential loss twice as much as a gain and act in that manner, even though it is irrational to do so.
That is a really good insight. I never connected that dot. Like I knew the work that Daniel Kahneman had done to like bring around that prospect theory that we have, that the loss aversion bias that we all carry with ourselves. But that being a driving factor to how we relate to technology, and like that being a psychological barrier that we have to having some realism when it comes to risk management in the AI space. That makes a lot of sense. I'd never connect those dots together. So one of the other sides I was thinking about, want to get your takes on is this need for continuous secure safety testing. So we saw with SB 53, the like governor saying like, hey, you now need to on a periodic cadence be um, putting out safety reports if you're a major frontier model. And there's some rules inside the legislation that really do ensure they get skewed towards the larger frontier models. Where do you think safety testing, or let's put it in a different way, like continuous red teaming or pen testing of AI systems? And where do you think that lives inside a risk management framework? Do you think that most people should be doing this? Like, do you think it has a home in as part of the risk management program, or is it something that's different from that? I just like to get your perspective on like where you're seeing the state of the industry now when it comes to this concept of like continuous safety testing, red team testing of AI systems.
In terms of red teaming and pen testing for AI systems, it will depend on the use case that you are employing the system for. So I'll give an example from one of the customers that we worked with. This is public information at this point. They're called Embold Health, and they launched a chatbot that allows people to select the physician that is most appropriate for them and that has the highest effectiveness rating and is covered by insurance. And so this is a pretty helpful technology, but it's obviously processing protected health information. So we did a very thorough AI risk assessment and penetration test of the system prior to release. So that's kind of the most extreme case. A potentially less sensitive use case would be a customer facing chatbot that's not handling protected health information. Maybe it's just answering FAQs. That might be a good situation to do a penetration test or a red teaming exercise because of the reputational risk that could be associated with a misbehaving chatbot. There was unfortunately a Chevrolet dealership a couple years ago that rolled out a completely unguardrailed version of GPT-4 and got punished in the news media for it. So avoiding that is important. And then kind of the least sensitive use case would be if you're only exposing generative AI APIs internally to trusted users, then you might still want to do some testing there. You could prioritize based on the higher sensitivity use cases.
I think this segues quite nicely. I know we want to talk about kind of vendor risk and third party risk. Like typically when you're doing, when you're getting vendor questionnaires, like when was your last pen test? Like, how often are you? Like, do you see this evolving for businesses that are utilizing AI more? Do you expect I guess the stakes of entry and the kind of vendor risk questionnaires evolving to kind of fall in line with like continuous red teaming and then across the board as well? We could probably kind of kick the segue fully into what this is going to mean for third party risk and vendor risk.
I've been a longtime critic of security questionnaires as a third party risk management tool, primarily because no one reads them. And as someone who has answered dozens and dozens and potentially hundreds of individual questions on questionnaires and receiving very few follow-up questions in my lifetime, I'm pretty sure I didn't do such a thorough job that no one had any follow-ups. I'm pretty sure that they just didn't read them. So that's a major weakness of the tool. But another one in the age of AI is the speed of change. So a lot of organizations will only send the questionnaire during the procurement process, and then renewals kind of a rubber stamp every year after that. If you look at how vendors are turning on AI features, how they're changing their terms of service, these things are moving very rapidly, and having even an annual review is going to leave you behind. You're not going to be able to identify some of these risks. So I think continuous risk monitoring, especially for your third parties and especially for your supply chain, is going to become even more important.
Do you think there's a role for AI to start changing how we do risk management and bringing AI into the continuous monitoring program that you were just describing?
100%. Definitely. So where I've seen the most use of AI in this space is probably the least effective from a security perspective, which is on AI security questionnaire answering. And we basically have people writing questionnaires, sending them to AI, and then not reading them. So no one ever reads the answers, really, is what's happening in that case. So that is probably, that's the most important from a business perspective, but it's the least important from a security perspective. Where there would be some serious use for artificial intelligence would be, for example, if you have your terms and conditions in a machine readable way, or even just a human readable way, a generative AI tool could go out and regularly query them and say, oh, okay, they changed their terms such that now they're training on this type of data, or they've removed an indemnification or it added an indemnification requirement for customers. That's something that could definitely be actionable. And then if you want to get really advanced, you could have, maybe companies authorize their customers to run AI powered red teaming exercises against their networks to identify vulnerabilities and then responsibly disclose those to the vendor. We've seen companies like Dropbox do this, not using AI powered red teaming, but they include their vendors within their bug bounty program, which I think is a really novel approach and potentially something that you could scale effectively with AI.
That would be a really good implementation of that. Yeah, I think an extension of what you said, I really like the way you're taking that, would be one of the things I've been looking at is this idea of continuous assurance. Do we now need to move out of this world of point in time assessments where we're getting assessed annually against our SOC 2 or our PCI or pick your thing? Or if in the federal space every 3 years, if you're under FedRAMP or CMMC, and say, can we not maybe move us to a world as an industry where we're having controls, we have control implementation statements, that we have technology that's implementing this, and we have the ability to monitor that and then present that back to the customer. I could imagine a world in a perfect state where it's not perfect, but a world where you're representing that you produce a technology, you do a continuous monitoring program, you put that available in your trust center, then you have your customers, their AI systems will then monitor that. They would be able to look at both the technical artifacts that are coming out, as well as what you were describing, the legal terms or the compliance shifts of the contractual agreements, and they'd be able to marry that together for a more informed risk process. But I don't think we're there yet. So maybe Connor will keep hoping for that day to turn around.
Maybe in 5 or 10 years.
Yeah.
How long is that in AI years? That's the
I was
question.
just going to say.
We'll all be on the beach by that point.
I
ChatGPT will be doing all our work.
just want someone to fold my laundry. Like, I'm not like, where's that coming?
That's probably going to be the most difficult use case.
Exactly.
It's like very, it's very irregular and like, you need a lot of tactile strength and things like that. So that's going to be hard to automate.
Robots, here we come. Here we go. So let's just maybe bring us back to our last section that I wanted to cover with you and get your perspective on, which was really around this shadow AI. So as we continue on this theme of vendor risk management, specifically around shadow AI. As someone who's run security programs for a while, a handful of years ago, it was shadow IT, where we had data leaving into IT systems. Now, that risk just kind of exploded when you had all these LLMs available via the browser, and people will say, like, I can put anything into this and I get my magic answer back. And so we're seeing a lot of shadow AI go across enterprises. There's some reports out there where people are citing like 60% of enterprises are reporting that shadow AI has led to at least one data exposure or compliance incident in the last 12 months. Like, there are research projects that are coming, they're saying like, yep, this is a real problem. And I don't think it takes much to realize that shadow AI is a particularly big problem. So Walter, what are some of the strategies that you're offering your clients, or you're encouraging the people that you're engaging with to get their hands around this particular risk area, and to reduce the risk of that exposure?
There are 3 things I would recommend to combat shadow AI. So first of all would be employee training, and specifically focusing on the why you are requesting that employees only use certain tools. And if you can highlight that in business terms, so for example, we don't want to have our intellectual property embedded into third-party AI models that are training on it, that would be an example. A second thing that companies can do is have a relatively efficient and simple approval process for new tools. So in the most sensitive environments, heavily regulated spaces, you might need to have an approval for every single tool or model that's being used. However, for less sensitive use cases or less heavily regulated industries, you may be able to take kind of a risk criteria approach to a tool, saying that any tool that meets these requirements is pre-approved. And then third of all, I would say you do need to have technical capabilities to identify what systems people are using and then helping them make more effective choices through administrative measures like nudging them or technical measures like blocking or redirecting attempts to access those tools.
I think the training thing is so important, right? I think it's really in security, it's so easy to say everyone's an idiot, right? Like it's the user's fault. Like, no one listened. Like the long and the short of it is our priorities are very different, right? Like our goalposts versus other people in the businesses goalposts are very, very different. And if you are, let's just say you're like a white collar worker, individual contributor, mid manager, and you go on the news and you're told that, hey, if you don't use AI, like you're turfed, right? Which is like a pretty common thing to read. I really do think the training and AI, like positive use AI enablement is so important, but it is, again, security is very good at sitting in its ivory tower when things go wrong, saying, oh yeah, it's the user's fault. Like this is a cultural thing. And this is one that you do really need executive buy-in from. But if the training is done in a business positive adult manner that allows people to continue to use this technology, I think it can only be good, because the overall cultural thing has to come from us. It has to come from the security teams, compliance team, maybe legal in some certain organizations. But if that doesn't go well, like I understand why people are screwing up, because if they're not getting better using AI, they feel like they're not going to have a job in 3 years. I can fully understand why people are accidentally, unpreparedly throwing, proprietary info, contracts, whatever into, non-regulated environments. Like I get it. It's just enabling them to be able to use these tools, get better in the safest possible way.
That's a really good, there's really good two sides of the coin there, because what I've seen and what I'm hearing you both kind of say or in different ways is we're in a moment where we're pressuring everyone to adopt these AI systems, right? It's like we look at the headline from MIT, oh, 95% of these things didn't work. And that's like a big crisis. And so there's this big attention on like, let's get more AI adopted. Every time we have an average employee at a company show up at their laptop, they've got too much work, not enough time, and they've been told use AI systems. At the same time, what you said, Walter, create a process that's very simple. Create a process where the path to get for your non-sensitive information, you have a clear and easy onboarding for that enables and encourages experimentation without stepping outside of your risk tolerance. I think that was a really good, just like simple take-home recommendation, because that sense of like reduce the barriers and then people will default to the easy path, and making the safe path, making the easy path the safe path makes a lot of sense to me, because we are creating a culture of like move fast. We are creating a cultural energy of like the pressure is on, and we've got these new AI technologies. Well, and by the way, we now need to do 900 steps of approval to get the technology to save your job. Like we are in this moment, I think it's the idea of being sensitive culturally to where we're at and creating process that lines up with our company's need for speed on these areas. And that was well said. What I'd like to do now is we have this final tradition, Walter, and I don't know if I prepared you for this. So maybe I'll start with Stu and then I'll come to you, then I'll get to me. So what we do at the end of every episode is we do a Monday morning quarterback. And this is simply, we drop these podcasts on Friday. The entire security community is listening to this over the weekend. It's actually pretty incredible. We have tens of millions of people listening to this every day. And then on Monday, they're going to get to work, right? So what encouragement do we give these teams that like they roll up on Monday morning and say, I can go do that? So it's the Monday morning quarterback. So Stu, with that, I'm going to start with you. They'll do Walter, they might do me. What is the advice you're giving our listeners this weekend to meditate on before they take action on Monday morning?
Timely, and I got segued nicely, but I think spend some time with your non-technical colleagues. Commit 30 minutes, an hour to encourage them to use AI systems, like to use innovation, but to use it safely, and how you think it's going to, move their career forwards. Again, going back to the point, people are uneasy. People are nervous what their future looks like. Encourage someone who may be non-technically minded to spend some time with AI, whatever your LLM of choice or your supermodel of choices. I think supermodel is the right term. I think I'm a different world. But encourage them and encourage them to use it in a way that is going to make the business feel very comfortable.
All right, Walter, any thoughts that you would give the audience for Monday morning?
My advice would be specifically for security and GRC folks is get into the weeds from a technical perspective, because that will help you understand the security, compliance, and privacy implications of AI systems more effectively. And I'll give you an example. So when Model Context Protocol came out, I was inundated by waves of papers and blog posts and things like that, and read through them, and thought I kind of understood how MCP worked. But I realized that I wasn't 100% confident in how it operated. So I said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm building an MCP server, which I did, and actually is now a feature in the StackAware platform. And it solved a use case that I had on my roadmap for a long time. But now I understand the security model much better, having actually built an MCP server for real and testing it out. So that'd be my recommendation: is roll up your sleeves and get your hands dirty.
That's amazing. That's the second time someone's given that advice. Last week, we had Jake Bernardes on the podcast, and he holds this viewpoint like it's gospel, which is you cannot be a security leader telling people not to do something with AI if you yourself aren't willing to get into the weeds and get into the mud. I just think that's amazing. We've had two now executives come on the show, and they're talking about like, open up your laptop, get close to technology and build it yourself, because you just learn what it actually means to do things. And then you can be so much more effective when communicating the real risks with these systems. Great advice.
Connor, what have you got for us?
So mine is going to be explore. It's so interesting. It's around education as well. I would want a leader who shows up on Monday morning to see how they could roll out that technical training for business teams, to teach them how to how to understand these primitive technologies, whether it's LLM, whether it's MCP servers, and have just that basic vocabulary of how these systems work and how you start to, as you start to chain them together, the risks that come around this. So again, we're just going to start with like basic technological education on the systems, but for the enterprise, you're helping level up your whole company. You're making them more aware of the technology systems so that they have the knowledge and vocabulary. So when they see a problem in the business, they can be like, this is the right job. We understand this process well enough to move it towards an agentic system that's going to solve this, or not. Actually, here's how you do process design and you do things. So instead of trying to make everyone a security expert, it's really just trying to level up the floor across the base of the company around their knowledge around AI and AI systems thinking. Well, Walter, I just want to say thank you so much for coming on to the episode today. It's been fantastic having you on here. Thank you for joining us. You are the CEO of StackAware, and I love that StackAware is really setting the pace for how to operationalize AI governance. Like I said, you came to the rescue for me many months ago when I was in the CISO seat and helping me understand some of the landscape when it comes to building out an effective AI governance. I love what you're doing that. I love how you're bringing engineering and policy together, and you're really helping organizations turn their compliance into a strategic advantage. So again, just thank you so much for you coming on the show today.
Connor, Stuart, thank you very much.
Thanks, Walter.
And to everyone who is listening, if you like what you heard today, please do follow Zero Signal Podcast on your favorite podcast app. Leave us a review and share this episode with a friend or a colleague. The review is really important because I read every single one, and we want to know how to make it better week over week. Really helps the community grow, helps us make the show better. So leave that comment, send us a note, or tag us in LinkedIn. Let us know what your thoughts are. So until next time, thanks for listening to Zero Signal.